Welcome to episode 64 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by true crime FBI cases. In this episode, we talk to retired agent James Gagliano, who served in the FBI for nearly 25 years. A graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, he was a commissioned Army officer before joining the Bureau. During his FBI career, Jimmy Gagliano worked organized crime, was a member of the Hostage Rescue Team, that's HRT, the FBI's elite counterterrorism unit. He participated in numerous overseas deployments and led the FBI's New York office SWAT Team. As a matter of fact, he was awarded the FBI's Medal of Bravery for actions while serving on the SWAT team. Gagliano is interviewed about heading up the New York Division's Hudson Valley Resident Agency and about his formation of the Hudson Valley Safe Streets Task Force. He also talks about the importance of community policing and how he used his role as a basketball coach to encourage, motivate, and mentor at-risk kids. His task force, a multi-agency unit, received the Top Gang Unit Award by the New York Gang Investigators Association and also received the True American Hero Award from the Federal Drug Agents Foundation for their multiple high-profile prosecutions of violent street gangs. Gagliano's last two assignments in the Bureau was as the acting Legal Attaché in Mexico City and as the Chief of Staff and Special Assistant to the Assistant Director in Charge, the ADIC, of the FBI's New York Division. Since retiring, Gagliano has become a sought-after speaker on the topics of leadership and combating the gang culture. He frequently appears as a guest law enforcement analyst on CNN and other television news programs. I had a great time speaking with Jimmy because of his basketball connection. I come from a basketball family. My husband's been coaching basketball since the very moment I met him. As a matter of fact, it's probably why I agreed to go out with him that first time. My twin daughters have been playing basketball since they were practically toddlers. They played Division II basketball in college. Let me brag a little bit. Both scored 1,000 points. And both of them are currently working as basketball coaches, one on the college level and the other coaches, little kids, for intramural programs with the Y. So I know all about how basketball can make a difference in the lives of young people. And I admire Jimmy Gagliano so much for the work that he does with at-risk kids. Before we get to that interview, just a few things. First of all, I will not be doing a podcast episode next week. I think I mentioned to you that one of my daughters is getting married, and so I am going to sneak down to Myrtle Beach and throw her a surprise bridal shower while she's hanging out with her girlfriends at her bachelorette party. So there's lots of work to do, so I will not be doing an episode next week, but I will be back with you the following weekend. I also want to remind you that new show by Dick Wolf, the producer of Law and Order, called Inside the FBI, premieres on Thursday, April the 27th at 10 o'clock on the USA Network. I'm going to be watching it, and I'll write a post about it in my May newsletter. Also in that May newsletter, if you are a writer or an author and you write about the FBI, I will be able to tell you how you can visit the New York office and speak to agents in person about cybercrime, international terrorism, the criminal programs and investigations. You can sign up for the newsletter, which is all about the FBI and books, TV, and movies on my website, jerrywilliams.com. I want to give a shout out to listener Benjamin Monroe from Georgetown, Kentucky. Benjamin emailed me and asked how long it takes to put an episode together. Great question, Benjamin. I love conducting the interviews and meeting the retired agents. And after the interview, it takes me an average of 8 to 10 hours to edit the audio, write up the summary, collect the photos, and the links to supporting newspaper articles and videos. Producing the episode is the fun part for me. It's like writing a novel. It's the creative project. The most time-consuming part of producing FBI Retired Case File Review is actually finding the agents to interview. I was thinking that I could put out a general email to all of the chapters of the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI, and that people would just call me up or write me back and say, yeah, I want to be on the show. But I guess agents are modest, and I actually have to figure out a case to review, track down who the case agent is, and then contact them personally to invite them to be on the show. You can help me out by sending a referral, a suggestion, a recommendation. So if you know of a closed case, especially something local that happened in your area that I might not even know about, but was a fantastic and intriguing investigation, or maybe you know of a retired agent. You read something in your local newspaper, or you saw something on TV. Please email me, tweet me, let me know about it, and I'll reach out and see if I can get that agent on the show. You don't know how much I would appreciate that. And the last thing is, I want to give a big thank you to Tom for reviewing my FBI crime thriller, Pay to Play, about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. He put a nice review on Amazon, and as you know, reviews help readers find good books. When you pick up a copy of Pay to Play for yourself or as a gift for someone you know loves crime fiction, you're helping me to continue to produce ad-free content on a weekly basis. Plus, as you can tell from the great reviews, Pay to Play is a good read. And now here's the show. I want to introduce my guest, Jimmy Gagliano. Hi, Jimmy. How are you?
I'm good, Jerry. How are you?
I'm doing great. I've been doing a lot of interviews about terrorism, but back in the day when I was in the FBI and even when you first started out, there were so many things that we did, and we still do them, but a lot of times people don't hear about them anymore.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that the FBI's mission is kind of evolved post 9/11. Some of the traditional criminal violations that we worked have kind of been minimized as we focus on the counterterrorism mission. So that's completely understandable. But people need to understand that the criminal division of the FBI is still robust and still makes a lot of great cases.
The FBI is still in the game.
Absolutely. I think that there's much more of a partnership effort, I think, between the FBI and local and state law enforcement. It's much more collegial. I think people are kind of used to watching the movies and seeing the FBI, come in, during the J. Edgar Hoover days where it was, okay, local, step aside, we're in charge here. And I think you and I kind of experienced during our careers around the same time that there was a metamorphosis took place. And obviously 9/11 was a big catalyst for that we have to work together with our partners. There just aren't enough resources to go around, and the FBI, as small an agency as we are, we have to have a partnership with our state and local officials, and I think that's pretty much where gang investigations are going now. They are going to be worked in the task force mode or the task force model.
All right, so give us a little introduction into the case that you are going to talk to us about today.
Sure. The case that you're highlighting is the one that targeted the Bloods and the Latin Kings, two national-based gangs that were basically terrorizing Newburgh. And Newburgh is a beautiful city in the state of New York. It's about 70 miles or so north of New York City. It was once considered to be the gateway to the Hudson. It was a 4-mile by 4 square mile city with about a population of 29,000 people. And I guess in the last 20 or so years, gangs have really begun to proliferate in the area. And there were some neighborhood-based gangs known as the Alley Cats and the Dark Side that operated there in the 90s. And once they came on the police radar and got disrupted and dismantled by some of the local Rockefeller drug laws in New York State, it kind of left a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the Bloods and the Latin Kings kind of filled that void in and began to really start an alarming trend of high homicide rates and all kinds of other violent crimes for the city of Newburgh that kind of came to head in about the 2008-2009 time frame.
Well, I can't wait till we get into the details, but before we do, if you could just tell us when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
I'm an Army brat. My father was a West Point grad, and I grew up in a military family, and I always had dreams of going to West Point, which I did, and going into the Army and having a military career, and I did that. And I guess I go back to the ties to an interest in the FBI. I go back to the mid-'80s. I was a cadet at the United States Military Academy, which obviously is in upstate New York, just south of Newburgh, New York. And I remember watching on a black and white television in a cadet day room the Paul Castellano murder, when John Gotti and members of the Gambino family rubbed out Paul Castellano and Tommy Bellotti, his bodyguard. I think that was right around Christmas time in 1985. I was a junior at the military academy. And I was fascinated in hearing about the FBI doing the investigation. And then a couple of years later, I'm an Army officer now, and I'm stationed upstate at Fort Drum, New York as an infantry officer. And my brother-in-law told me, hey, I got this book and you got to read it. It's called Donnie Brasco, and it's about a guy named Joe Pistone who was an FBI agent, and he, infiltrated the mob, and he almost got made. And I picked up the book. It came out, I think, in 1988, and I read it, and I immediately knew that at the completion of my military career that becoming an FBI agent was something I wanted to do. And I applied, and it was several years later in February of 1991 that I was able to get to the FBI Academy. So that's kind of, everybody's got their own story. That's kind of the story, the progression, the chronological sequence of how the FBI came on my radar. And I met along the way a former FBI agent, a gentleman who's retired now named Eddie Peterson, who worked in the Newark office. And Eddie is a guy who was retired as a GS-13 special agent, but he had worked everything. He had worked bank robberies and kidnappings and all the traditional FBI violations at that time. And he took the time to sit down and talk with me when I was a cadet at West Point, and he expressed interest. And I was fascinated by his stories, and I truly credit him taking that time, paying it forward, giving back to sit down and listen to some wet behind the ears kid. And I mentioned him in my retirement speech in December of 2015 from the FBI because it had such an impact on my life. So that's kind of the trajectory of how the FBI came on my radar and why I joined.
So when did you start working this drug case in Newburgh?
I spent time working on an organized crime squad. I worked on a Colombian cocaine squad back in the mid-'90s. I was assigned to the hostage rescue team for 4 years, came back to New York, worked drugs and undercover on a number of different squads out of Manhattan, and then I was a crisis management coordinator for the New York City office of the FBI, and all those things kind of led up to me being posted to Newburgh. And what happened was I lived upstate, very close to Newburgh, and I was a basketball coach. I still am. I consider that to be just as much an important part of my life as being an FBI agent was. And I was coaching at the Boys and Girls Club and at a couple of Catholic churches that were located up in Newburgh. And I saw what was going on. I mean, I saw the kids that were in the drug trade, and I saw the folks that were touched by homicide, whether they were involved with it or the perpetrators or victims and the families. And it really came to a head in April and May of 2008. A youngster that I had coached by the name of Jeffrey Zachary in Newburgh was gunned down by a couple of Latin Kings in a case of mistaken identity. He was a young African-American kid, around 13 years old, straight A student, no involvement in the gangs whatsoever, and his only sin was sitting on his porch in the evening laughing with a couple of friends, and a couple of Latin Kings had been dispatched by the then head of the Latin Kings, a guy by the name of Wilson Guns Paigan, drove by, saw him sitting there, and just assumed by the color of his skin that he was a blood, and they shot him, and he died. And knowing the kid and seeing what that did to Newburgh, I mean, again, was this the first death of a young African-American male in Newburgh? Of course not. But this kid just being, you know, such a good kid, and you know, almost 10 years later, you know, could have been a graduate from college, getting his master's degree, doing something wonderful in life. He had all the potential in the world, and to have his life snuffed out. And for his mother to deal with not just him, but having lost another son just a few years earlier to the same type of thing, to gang violence, it was a tough pill to swallow. And I had been pestering the folks at the New York office of the FBI for a number of months, if not a number of years, saying, "Hey, we've really got this. It's not an epidemic. It's a pandemic. It's reached pandemic proportions up in Newburgh, and we got to do something about this. And yes, Al-Qaeda is important, and yes, focusing on counter-intel is important. But remember, the FBI's, you know, our prime responsibility is to provide resources and to use, you know, federal statute to help the state and the locals that we partner with. And this is what's going on up there. And it took the Jeffrey Zachary murder to make that happen. I was dispatched up to Newburgh shortly after that. And my mission was to put together a task force and figure out some way to mitigate the gang violence.
Wow. Reading an article that you sent me, and they called it the murder capital of New York.
Yes, I mean, I think for people to understand, I mean, per capita, I mean, as I said earlier, Newburgh is a city that's 29,000 people. Well, you look at New York City, and it's got 8.4, 8.5 million people. But because Newburgh was suffering 15, 18, 17, 13 homicides, when you look at that as a percentage of the population, Newburgh had a higher homicide rate than Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, the South Bronx, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, Brownsville, Brooklyn, all these places that you would immediately hear the name and you would associate, oh, that's a dangerous place. But it wasn't. It was Newburgh, New York. And I kind of look at my career as the bookends of that. When I got to New York City in 1991, you know, New York City was still kind of in the throes of the crack wars of the late 80s. And at the end of the first year that I was in New York, 1991, I believe there were somewhere around 2,231 homicides. When I retired at the end of December, and this is through, you know, this is not a credit to me, but when I retired in December of 2015, those that homicide rate had been depressed down to around 300 or 320 homicides. Now, that's about a 87% reduction in homicides. But as you know, because you've been in the business and you've been a criminal investigator, crime, you can't eradicate it. You might be able to suppress it in a particular area or, you know, push it somewhere else, but where that crime went ultimately was to the suburbs. So as New York City, using CompStat and broken windows policing and stop, question, and frisk and all those policing methodologies that obviously are in the news today, as New York City began to have success with those in driving down the violent crime rate, where did that violent crime matriculate to? Up to Newburgh. And Newburgh was one of the suburbs that bore the brunt of that, and that's why, yes, as you just correctly characterized it, at that time it was the murder capital of New York State.
All right, so you have this motivation because you know this kid that has become a victim of the gang. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Latin Kings and
the Bloods? Yes. If you study the history of gangs, and I always take this back. I'm not a psychologist or sociologist, but I do enjoy the study of why things happen and why people act in particular ways, especially as it's related to groups and organizations. And if you think about the mafia when it started in Sicily, the purpose of it, the intention was good. They were, Sicilian peasants that were working in a secret organization to protect their countrymen from, oppressors from all the different countries that came into Sicily and basically occupied it. And then they came to the United States, obviously they came through Ellis Island once they established foot in the United States. And then those protectors and saviors began to become parasites on the very citizenry that they had taken an oath to protect. And it's the same thing with gangs. If you look back on the history of South Central Los Angeles and the Bloods and the Crips, those gangs were set up to protect their neighborhoods, and they weren't set up to rob and to extort and to establish prostitution and gambling and other vice trades, or to commit homicides or senseless killings. But when the Bloods and the Crips began to war in South Central, and they were put on the map essentially because of the incredible wanton violence. That also matriculated to the prison system, and the prison systems in this country had predominantly been dominated by Hispanic and Latino gangs. You had La M.A. and you had the Latin Kings that were established there basically as protection for the Hispanic population in jail. And in prison, you're kind of compelled to stay with your race. I mean, that's your protective base. And believe it or not, the Bloods, that became established out in South Central, they began to proliferate in jail, the Pyrus. And the reason that they did was because the Hispanic gangs were they had such a stranglehold on the prison population that the Bloods basically formed in prison to protect African Americans that were in jail. And so when they started getting out of jail, that's when they started to come back. And obviously, you know how it is in this country. If you have a felony on your record, it is very damn difficult to reassimilate back into population, back into to our population, because you've got that strike against you. And so what do? They end up going back to the streets. They end up going back to what they know. And that's essentially what happened in Newburgh. So guys would go away to jail, they'd become gang members, they'd come back to Newburgh, and all of a sudden they fell back into place, and they re-entered into the criminal syndicate that they had been in when they were in jail.
So once you decide to start doing something about these gangs, how do you even start?
Well, there were a couple things that I had as thoughts. And if you'll remember, now you got to go back, now this is almost a decade ago. The military, the United States military, had begun to have some success in places like Iraq and later on in Afghanistan with a thing called the surge. And the surge was a tactic where military commanders would flood a certain area or a sector with extra troops and try to tamp down the insurgent violence and try to get a handle on some areas that were lawless in those combat theaters. Well, the theory that we developed was we need to do the same thing here in New York, because we've got a huge problem in Newburgh, and the neighboring communities are fine, and other parts of New York are fine, or the crime rate is much lower. But here in Newburgh, there's enough crime to it really, Jerry, it shocked the senses. So I went to the bosses at the NYO, the New York office of the FBI, and I said, I need some help. And they said to me, okay, what's your plan? I said, I want to build a task force, and I want it to be a multi-agency task force. I want it to be federal prosecutions, which at the time we had a lot of difficulty getting because the Southern District of New York, particularly the White Plains office, was notoriously difficult to deal with. They didn't like to deal with gang cases, and they didn't like to deal with some of the crime that we had up here in the northern counties of Sullivan, Dutchess, and Orange, which I was the Supervisory Senior Resident Agent over. So I was struggling fighting City Hall, trying to get the Southern District to kind of take notice of what was going on. I needed to get some more agents, and I was lucky at the time because there were a couple of bosses that came in line. Joe Demarest, who was the assistant director in charge, Don Ackerman, who was the assistant special agent in charge, and they were very supportive, and they said, you got it. You give us a list of 5 agents that you want to add to the task force, because my squad at the time was depleted, and you'll laugh at this, I had 5 agents on the squad. So they gave me the pick of the litter. I picked 5 folks that I had worked with before, either on SWAT or through some of my other casework, and convinced them to come up to help me out. And then in the 3 counties that I was, the FBI chief over, I think there's some 52 or 53 different police agencies, and that includes local jurisdictions, state police, sheriff's offices. And what I did was I had my secretary set it up. Over the course of my first month in the position, I made a trip to each of those agencies. And as you know, most of them were shocked because they were like, well, that's not how the FBI does business. They normally have us come to them, but you're coming to us. And I basically went to them like the New York lottery with $1 and a dream, and I sold them on a dream that we were going to put together a multi-agency task force. We were going to work in concert together. No one agency was going to get all the credit, but I desperately needed resources from them. And in return for them providing me with their investigators or a detective that they would attach to the task force, I then would get the Southern District on board to handle the prosecutions, and I would be able to pay overtime through, as you know, through HIDA funding. I would be able to pay their overtime and provide rental cars for the use of their detectives, which helped their departments out. So that was essentially how it worked. I kind of went out there. I had a vision of what it would look like. I knew that we wanted to work these like the RICO cases that we worked in La Cosa Nostra for the Mafia, the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, where you can attack the upper echelon of a criminal syndicate because you prove first the enterprise, and then you find 2 or 3 different predicates that the organization is in violation of, and then you can attack the people at the top even if they never pulled the triggers or they never did the crimes. So I knew I had a template for what I wanted to do, but I finally had the right pieces in place. And then when Preet Bharara was selected by President Obama as the United States Attorney in the Southern District, that's when everything finally coalesced and came together, because now I had somebody who truly wanted to partner with us. He became a big fan of what we were doing, and he provided us some really good prosecutors, and that's how the case started.
So who were the heads of the Latin Kings and the Bloods? Were you able to identify them right out, or did you have to work to figure out who they were?
No, we knew who they were. In fact, in my, I had a day job, which was as an FBI chief. My night job was coaching basketball, and I saw these guys, during the course of my night job. I mean, I coached at the Boys and Girls Club in Newburgh on Liberty Street, which is one of the main streets where there was a lot of violence, and that street was owned by the Bloods. And I'll never forget, there were nights that I would go in there, my basketball practice for my young men was at 7 o'clock, and then I would see, Anthony 00 Boykin, who was the leader of the Bloods at the time, come out of the Boys and Girls Club because one of his family members was having a baby shower, and he was invited, and literally pass right by him in the hallway. I'd see him outside during the summertime when, Newburgh has outdoor courts on Gidney Avenue where, in the summer they have basketball tournaments, and everybody that, goes to see the young guys play. And I would go to those basketball tournaments just to watch the players and see some of my kids that had grown up and were now 18, 19, in their 20s playing in this tournament, and he and the Bloods would be standing off to the side. So I knew who he was. I didn't need anybody to tell me the upper structure of the Bloods. Now, identifying the mid-level and identifying all the soldiers, that took some time, and that really, we can't, on the FBI side, take credit for that. That was a credit to the Newburgh Police Department. They assigned 2 detectives to me. Chief Eric Palilli, who was the chief back in 2008, gave me a detective by the name of Stephen Bunt and another detective by the name of Joe Strack. And I assigned Joe Strack to the Latin King investigation, and I assigned Steve to the Blood investigation. Those 2 detectives had such an encyclopedic memory and recall for all the Bloods and all the Latin Kings from when they were young kids, and they knew them. I knew some of them through basketball, but these guys knew them through the judicial system piece. And so we were able to, again, leverage that relationship with the Newburgh Police Department because we had a true partnership. Those 2 detectives were housed in our FBI office worked, side by side with the agents and the New York State police investigators, and really building that. I can't give myself credit because these agents and these detectives and these investigators made these great cases. The prosecutors at the Southern District were the ones that prosecuted these cases. But the one thing that I can say, yes, I'm glad that I was there to do that, was to bring these folks together and bring them onto one team finally and get everybody working towards the same goal, which was to disrupt and dismantle the Bloods and the Latin Kings. And I think that's what we did.
And this is the Hudson Valley Safe Streets Task Force.
That's the name. Yep, that's the name that we gave it. The federal government has Safe Streets Task Forces, and this one was named. We didn't want to call it the Newburgh Safe Streets Task Force because we also worked in other places like Monticello, in Beacon, New York, in Poughkeepsie, New York, in Middletown, New York, and other places where there was also gang activity and the attendant drug violence. So we called it the Hudson Valley Safe Streets Task Force.
All right, so, I worked in the Philly division, but I spent several years, maybe 4 years, out in our Cherry Hill RA, which does investigations in Camden. So I spent time involved in drug investigations in Camden. I jokingly say that's because there always needs to be a female agent around to stand by as the drug dealers' girlfriends put their clothes on, because whenever you do a raid in the middle of the morning, there's always naked women around. So that was my job, to make sure the naked women got dressed as we handcuffed them and took them out the door. But I did do a lot of drug raids and drug searches and drug arrests in the Camden area, so I know how it all works. Did you have an undercover? Did you have an informant? Were you making drug buys? How did you start to infiltrate the group and find out who's who and what's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jerry. And really, I'd say that the genesis of this whole effort, yes, the Hudson Valley Safe Streets Task Force was kind of the appliance or the mechanism that ultimately dismantled these gangs. But this all started back probably in the early or the mid-2000s, before I got to Newburgh, as the law enforcement chief. This started when the Newburgh Police Department had partnered with the New York State Police. And they went out and they did a number of drug buys, and yes, they used a cooperator. He was a cooperating informant. He was not a cooperating witness. As you know, a cooperating witness is going to testify. A cooperating informant does not. He provides information, or she provides information, and sometimes would make drug buys that the police were able to successfully prosecute, because these were videotaped, audio-taped drug buys. Well, they weren't targeting the gangs per se, but they ended up making a number of drug buys from the Bloods and the Latin Kings. So what we did was we went back and we painstakingly, the folks on the task force, of course not me, because you know how it is with bosses, we get the glory, but it's actually the agents and the investigators that are doing the hard work. So they painstakingly went through these drug buys, and they identified folks that we knew were Bloods, and they identified folks we knew were Latin Kings. That was the start of our case, because when you're building a RICO case or a complex narcotics conspiracy case, you're able to do things like aggregate the buys. So what I mean by that is, if one person sells you, an 8-ball of crack, and another person sells you a half a kilo of powder, another person sells you a couple of rocks of cocaine, all those things become aggregated. They get totaled together, and then that goes against the enterprise. That kind of gave us a head start. Then we went out. We got a couple of different cooperating informants or confidential informants and cooperating witnesses, and we put them to work. That we coupled with also putting out some undercover agents, undercover detectives, and having them make buys as well. So we figured if any of these avenues is unsuccessful, we had enough different kind of angles that we were going to be successful in that. And the drug case was essentially the impetus behind us moving into the RICO case. We had to make the drug buys because at the time, you remember the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines were very severe. They were almost draconian in how they looked at crack cocaine buys. So if
Absolutely.
so if we bought a few, ounces of crack from one person, they could be facing 5 to 10 years. Well, when somebody's facing 5 to 10 years, that's a big difference. But then if they're going to get a bid for, 11 months where they're like, hey, I can do that standing on my head, we now had leverage. So we started picking off the ones that we thought would be the most prone to cooperate and then flipped them. And then they, in turn, as I say all the time, I worked undercover in the FBI for many years. Even today, with almost, half of Newburgh knowing me by face and by sight, I could probably walk down Lander Street and buy crack, because, people just, the greed factor, you can buy crack easily. But I'm not going to see somebody kill somebody, and I'm not going to see somebody beat somebody. For those things, for those violations, you really need to have somebody on the inside. And once we started to apply leverage, and we had, 10 years to hang over somebody, we were able to get some fairly high-level gang members in both gangs to flip and cooperate with us. And then once they did, we had them wear a wire, and we consensually monitored conversations, and we were able to capture conversations where gang business was being discussed, murders were being discussed, prior criminal acts were detailed, and that really kind of opened the floodgates for us.
The two gangs, were they going after each other?
There was an open and declared war, to the point where, Latin Kings would go out and, attempt to kill a Blood, and sometimes they were successful, and then in retaliation, the Bloods would send some of their assassins out, and they would attempt to and ultimately were successful in a number of instances of killing a Latin King. And it was tragic because sometimes the victims of these retribution shootings, they weren't thugs in the sense of this is a guy that's been a gangbanger for 20 years. They were kind of peripheral members, hangers-on, strap hangers, if you will, and they were at the very lower end. Yes, they hustled crack. Yes, they might have, put a red bandana in their pocket and called themselves a Blood, but were they committed gangsters? And I would submit, knowing Newburgh the way that I did before I started working there, I'd say no. And unfortunately, they ended up being the victims in those retaliatory strikes. And we had a number of those that happened while we were working the case. And it's some of my biggest regrets, because you always wish that when you're in it and you're in charge of it and you're responsible for putting a stop to these things, that you can circumvent them before they happen. And it doesn't always happen that way. I mean, I'm proud of the fact that here it is almost 10 years later, and we sent over 200 gangsters to jail. And there are probably young men and maybe other people, women, older women and young children that are alive today because we took those folks off the street. But my biggest regrets, I don't sit around and celebrate, the lives we saved. I look back and go, could we have saved Tarzan, who really, was a young kid that was, wrapped up in this, but, wasn't your prototypical gangster. He was a sweet soul who just got murdered and for being in the gang life. And was there something we could have done? Should I have recognized something? Should I have heard something on one of the tapes? Should we have gotten word from our cooperating witnesses or our confidential informants? And I think that's the toughest part, wishing that there was something you could have done differently to maybe save one of those lives that were lost when we were just getting started.
Did they have like a fatalistic mentality that I may die, it could happen, but I don't have a choice?
And again, this is hard for me because Newburgh is a city that I love desperately. I mean, and I have so much invested in, and Newburgh has given to me far more than I could have ever given back to it on the law enforcement end or on the volunteer coaching mentorship end. I think part of it, and I think your term, that the fatalistic view of life may be accurate. Some of the young men that I coached, if I addressed them or yelled at them about something that they did or didn't do when they were in my charge, whether it was skipping school or not showing up for practice or disrespecting their mother or another adult, their thinking was, what does it matter what you're trying to tell me about a future? Because I live in Newburgh. I mean, I'm going to be dead in a couple of years. What does it matter? And I'm not being over the top or employing super supercharged hyperbole by saying that. That's not an abstraction. That's exactly what they would say to me. And that's a tough thing to deal with because, you're looking at a young man full of promise that, you go, gosh, you don't see what could be ahead of you. You don't see your value. But unfortunately, for many of them, they don't. They don't value someone else's life because they have no regard for their own life. And that culture that I'm 10 feet tall and I'm bulletproof and I'm not going to let anybody tell me anything, I'm in charge, when they're 13, 14, 15, 18 years old. Does that contribute to it? Sure, Jerry, I would submit that it probably does.
Mm. Yeah, and, I actually, before I became an agent, I was a juvenile probation officer, so I know those kids. I know those kids that you're talking about. And, it's a shame. They're not bad kids.
No,
they're just in bad situations.
You're absolutely right, and I mean, listen. I mean, you look at the demographics in the city of Newburgh. It's a diverse community. I mean, it's obviously become much more populous with Latino immigrants, but it's predominantly African American, and in the neighborhoods there. And again, to put on my sociologist hat for a second. In the neighborhoods there, 70% of the childbirths are out of wedlock. And, if you look at guaranteed poverty indicators, here's 3 of them. Okay, I'll give you the 3 things that if you have 1 or 2 of these, you're probably got a good chance to end up in poverty. If you have all 3, it is almost a guarantee that you're going to be spending your life in poverty. The first is have a child out of wedlock. The second is have a child before you're 18, and the third is do not finish high school. So if you do those 3 things, it is almost by all statistics and studies and empirical data compression, but it is almost a guarantee. And in Newburgh, and especially now, you got to remember, this is back in 2008. Remember what was going on in the economy. I mean, the economy had tanked. We were bleeding jobs off like crazy every month. And so even if at the height of the recession, we were at 12, 13% unemployment, if you were an African American or a Latino male between the ages of 18 and 34 in Newburgh at that time, the unemployment rate was probably closer to 50%. And then when you compound that with the fact in New York State, 1 out of every 2 African American males do not graduate from high school, those 2 statistics right there, those are damning. And when you talk about people being forlorn or not having hope or being full of despair and then looking for something, and as I always talk about, we all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And you and I found it. We found the FBI. That was our calling. We wanted to be part of something bigger than ourselves. The blue and the gold and the FBI motto and the people that we work with and the mission was the thing that we were attracted to. But we had the proper guidance. We were in the right position. We got the education we needed. We knew how to, make a first impression and handle an interview. And we were lucky and blessed enough to get into the FBI. For many of those young men, they don't see that as an opportunity. And I talk to them all the time because my dream would be for one of these young men to become an FBI agent. And I got a couple of them that are cops, and I'm going to make sure that they use that as a springboard to become an FBI agent. But many of them don't see that as an option. And here was the tough thing that I also faced as an FBI agent. You're not a social worker, right? So that's what I did in my part-time. And it wasn't a social worker. I'm a basketball coach, but that's my way of connecting with the community. And as I've said many times before, that gave me traction in the Newburgh community, so that when people knew me as Coach Jimmy long before they knew me as the FBI chief, James Gagliano. So when this all came down, the first of a number of big gang cases came down, May 13th of 2010, when this first came down, I had a traction in the community that was different than most law enforcement officers would have, because I had been there beforehand. And I think, Jerry, as we see the division and the chasm between police and communities, especially inner city communities or communities of color across the country, I think a big piece of that is that there is a distrust between the communities and the police, and it goes 2 ways. And a lot of that is because people are policing where they don't live. And for most of my life, I had policed in New York City, or I policed in Afghanistan, or I policed in, Long Island. And then when I finally, in 2008, began to work in the community where I had been before, it made all the difference in the world, because I think without that, to do what we were able to do, to attack the gangs the way that we did, as relentlessly as, just the momentum and the one case after the next, people did, the majority of people, you're always going to have the crackpots on both ends, but the majority of people looked at it and said, hey, if that guy and the people that work for him are doing this, it's righteous. We're not worried about drugs being planted. We're not worried about things being fabricated. We're not worried about police brutality, because that guy does things the right way. And that made a huge difference. The community felt like, I believe, and of course not every person, but I think the majority of the community felt like they were complicit with the police. They were working with the police. And I'm not talking about in the cooperation mode where they're going to run to us every 5 seconds and say, hey, so-and-so is doing so-and-so. But they felt like we were part of the community, and we were trying to make the community better, and we weren't outliers. We weren't coming in from the outside like an occupying force. And I think that made a huge difference.
One of the things that happens often in Philadelphia is that you might have a shooting where an innocent bystander, usually a child, is shot and killed, and, the problem is getting people from the neighborhood to cooperate with the police. Did you see anything like that, where people wanted to, but they were scared? They were so afraid.
Yes, there is that. And it's a struggle, I think, for law enforcement, because, to solve crimes without cooperation, it makes it exponentially more difficult. And law enforcement in communities where they have a good relationship, a symbiotic relationship, are much more successful. I'm sure I could pull up crime statistics to prove that. I don't have the empirical data in front of me, but I'm sure that I could show that. I think it is difficult when you're dealing with, again, going back to that chasm between the police and inner city communities, because the culture there says the police are the enemy, or the police are the occupying force. So a percentage of the population doesn't cooperate because of that. Snitches get stitches and rats and all that stuff. Then you've also got another piece of the community that doesn't think that way, but they may be intimidated, they may be fearful. And part of that's because, hey, I live next door to these guys. I can't go to the police and share this information because you guys go home at night. I'm still here in the neighborhood. So that piece of it, I think, affects it as well. Once we were able to take away some of the really bad apples, because the vast majority of the people in the city of Newburgh are good, honest, decent people. And once we were able to cut the head of the snake off and get the Boykins and the Paigans, the two leaders, and then much of their head council, the people that were, on the Crown Council for the Latin Kings and the upper echelon, captains for the Bloods. Once we were able to get those guys charged, indicted, and convicted and sentenced and sent away for, a few of them got double life plus 45 or life plus whatever. Once we were able to do that, I think that freed the neighborhood up, because then the people that were less intent on cooperating because of their fears became a little less fearful. Does that mean that there's no worry about retribution or somebody giving somebody a hard time or threatening somebody or intimidating somebody because they cooperated? No, of course not. But I think it changed it enough where we were able to have more cooperation than we would have had before.
So I think you mentioned this before, that you used, RICO in order to go after these gangs just like you would the mob. I know for the mob, a lot of times, you wire up the social club or where they meet. Could you tell me more about that? Because you also said something about Crown Council. So
sure. Well, sometimes there were some things that were fortuitous for us. You know how sometimes it is in investigations. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and there were certainly times where we conducted a search warrant and found things from, Latin Kings, like a complete copy of their manifesto, which had all their rules and all their code
there's
names.
Rules? There's rules in gangs?
Oh, they're just like you would think for the Mafia or La Cosa Nostra, the gangs have rules. I mean, hey, the most rules you're ever going to come across is if you're an inmate in prison, and those rules are not necessarily put into place by prison staff or corrections officers. They're put in place by the prisoners themselves. I mean, the rule of law exists everywhere, and it doesn't have to be implemented by the state. And the Latin Kings had a very, very draconian system of rules, how you had to act and conduct yourself and comport yourself, and if you had a particular position, what that entailed, and the type of respect it engendered. And the Bloods, in a more limited sense, had the same thing. So we were lucky to come across actual writings that helped establish the enterprise. And sometimes, when somebody's incarcerated, they have less rights to privacy than folks like me and you that are not incarcerated. So we were able to look at prison mail from, some of the gang members that were incarcerated that would be writing to gang members on the outside. We were able to review those. And then we also were able to put up what we call in the FBI poll cameras. So they were cameras that were put up on structures. I'm not going to get into the detail of exactly how or where, but we put them up on certain structures that you would not be able to notice with the naked eye. And I'll leave it at that. Those cameras were able to capture, now they didn't capture audio, but they were able to capture meetings. They were able to capture assaults. They were able to capture handoffs. So in areas where we could not physically surveil, the old, two officers in a car behind the wheel, the lights out, and they're using binoculars and watching what's going on. In areas where we couldn't do that, we had other means to be able to do that, and all that contributed towards establishing the enterprise. We had to prove that these guys were not a loose affiliation, but they were actually a criminal syndicate, and that's how we were able to use RICO to go after them just like you would the mob.
How many people are in these two gangs? What type of an arrest scenario do you arrange for something like this?
Well, the first one was the biggest one, and the first one, which took place on May 13th in 2010, we actually were able to secrete 500 law enforcement officers in the city of Newburgh for the first takedown because we had a huge narcotics conspiracy. We didn't have the RICO case yet, but we had a huge narcotics conspiracy against the Bloods and the Latin Kings, 60 Blood indictments and 18 Latin King indictments. Those 78 indictments were the starting point or the genesis of what then morphed into RICO indictments down the road. But we were able to get the guys off the street on the drug conspiracy charges and then patiently work backwards to put together the RICO cases. And what we did was there was a New York State armory in Newburgh. I was able to, working with Eric Palilli, who was the chief of police for the city of Newburgh, we were able to successfully lobby Albany, which is the seat of government for the state of New York, to get access to the armory. And it had been closed for 2 years. We secretly opened it up, and then the night before the takedown on May 13th, in dribs and drabs, bits and pieces, I had police officers, agents, investigators from all over slowly come down to the armory, and I secreted them inside the armory until that next morning. And so that's where we briefed everybody, and then that's where we launched from. And that essentially, that case, and the great thing about it was I think at the end of the day we were missing 12 out of the 78. And as I told everybody before, I'm not worried because it's the federal government and we will find everybody. And I believe it was about a year later that the United States Marshal Service made the final arrest of one of the Bloods outside of a seedy motel down in Georgia somewhere. So kind of things that come full circle for me because the last arrest happened to be in Georgia where I'm from. But we got them all. And then that case, like I said, became the genesis, the building block for subsequent cases after. And I think we did the Bloods RICO case. I want to say it was in early 2011, followed by the Latin King RICO case, and then basically those cases just built on more and more. We just basically superseded after that and added more members on. But all in all, I'd say in the course of the 4 years I was there, I think we tallied a total of 225 or 230 total indictments, convictions, and sentences. Nobody that we indicted ultimately beat the charges. There were some guys that did not get convicted on all counts, but everybody went away on that. And that, I think, was a contributing factor to bringing down the murder rate and the violence, the prevalent violence in Newburgh that I don't want to say that we enjoy today, because there's obviously still problems, but it's not at the level or the magnitude that it was when we started this in 2008.
During the 4 years that you were working on this, were you still coaching during that time?
I was, and interestingly enough, not to be specific, but I live about 2.5 miles from ground zero of the gangs in Newburgh. I live not far from there at all. And obviously, a number of the young men that I had coached, some of them had grown up, many of them went in the right direction, some of them didn't go in the right direction, but, obviously know where I live. And at one point in time, the leader of the Newburgh Bloods had put out a hit and said that he knew that the coach was running operations. That's how he referred to me in the conversation to one of our cooperators. He says he knew the coach was pulling the strings on this thing and he was going to have him whacked. So, of course, when this word gets back to hire, you know how the FBI is, Jerry. And so this spun everybody up, and I got called down, and everything was stood down for a hot second. They call me down. They say, we're going to transfer you, and you can go wherever you want. In the New York division being as big as it is, they could have moved me to Long Island, and it would have been 100-plus miles away, or we can give you your OP. And I said, hey, I'm not going anywhere. See, here's the thing. You can move me professionally. So if you want me to start working out of another office, that's well and good. But I'm not selling my house and I'm not moving. And you can't keep me away from Newburgh. I have responsibilities there that have nothing to do with law enforcement. And all you're doing is taking the gun out of my hand and the badge out of my hand when I'm working there, because I still go there at night in a T-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops without a gun to coach. So if I'm going to continue to do that, because I cannot run away from these guys like that, if I'm going to continue to do that, what good is it going to be to take me off this case? You cannot take me off this case. And luckily at the time, that assistant director in charge that I spoke about, Joe Demarest, was a reasonable man and a guy that understood me and got me and kind of came from my world. We'd been on the SWAT team together years before that. And he said, okay, I'm not going to force you to do that or compel you to do that, but we are going to put a security system in at your house and take care of a few other certain things, again, that I'm not going to get into, but in regards to your safety and your security, and same for your family. And so they did that. So I was satisfied with it. They were satisfied with it. A couple months later, we were able to pick up the guy who made the threat, and he went away for many, 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 many years, and we moved on from it.
Did he get charged with actually making the threat?
He did not, and the only reason that he didn't was he ultimately ended up being convicted of murder, ordering a murder, numbers of narcotics, conspiracy violations, armed robberies, a number of things, and the sentence he got was double life plus 45. So I don't think there was anything they could have added to that would have made it any more of a substantial sentence. So I'm satisfied with what he got on there. So,
did any of the kids that you coached end up in the gang?
Yeah, one of the toughest parts, I think, of my FBI career, and I spent 25 years, a quarter of a century, and I left right before I was 51, so I spent half my life in the FBI. And I have to say, one of the most difficult, if not the difficult moments I ever had was, it was probably early in the original investigation into the Bloods, and so I'm going to say it was around 2009. And at the time, I could no longer go into Newburgh, in a work capacity and oversee a street buy or pull security or be a couple of blocks off of a set if we were, photographing or videoing a meeting or a hand-to-hand or something like that. So,
is that because you were afraid of being recognized?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no matter how many times we changed out my cars, I mean, I'm almost 6'4", shaved head, tattooed. I kind of stand out in Newburgh, looking the way that I do as a white guy my size, and obviously being somebody that a lot of people in Newburgh knew from the coaching circles. So for me to go there and sit around the corner or to help out in these things, it was an impossibility. So our technical folks wired a CCTV feed into my office, and I was telling you about some of the cameras that we had installed along in various parts of Newburgh to cover the areas that the Bloods and the Latin Kings frequented and where things happened. And it was one night, and it was in the wintertime. It was cold, and I remember watching, it was supposed to be a drug buy, and I forget what it was, a half kilo or something like that, or a few 8 balls. I forget the exact quantity of drugs that were being purchased. And I had a cooperating informant and one of our undercover officers in a car, and I saw him pull up on the street where the deal was supposed to go down, and everything looked good, and I sat back, put my foot up on my desk, and leaned back, and I'm watching it, and I see the target, the blood that we expected to come out of the location that we expected, and he bounds down the steps. And again, it's cold. The kids in Newburgh are wearing, typically those bubble jackets, the down jackets, like the North Face jackets, and the baseball caps with the flat brims, and they're pulled way down low, and he had a hoodie up. But I recognized the guy, got a good look at him, and he got in the backseat of the car, and the deal started to ostensibly go down. And then I saw a little movement on the left side of the television, and I saw another kid come out of the door of the house where the other blood had come out of, and again dressed the same way with the with the heavy duty jacket on, the hoodie with the hood up, with the baseball cap pulled down low. And I saw him walk, and I saw him bound down the same steps, and I saw him cross the street to go get into the other side of the backseat of the car, and my heart sunk because I knew the walk. And this was a kid that had played basketball for me a few years before. He'd been on one of my really, really talented AAU teams with the Newburgh Zion Lions that I used to run out of a program that was at St. Mary's Church. And I physically got ill. I got nauseous. The deal goes down. I see him get out. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt who this kid is. So when the guys get back, the detective and the cooperating or the confidential informant and some of the other officers and agents, I broke the news to them, and I said, "Did you know who the guy that came to the car second and got in after the first guy was?" And they're like, "No, we didn't know who he was, but he brought the product." And then I immediately knew that he was facing 10 years. The amount, and obviously with the aggregation, the ability to aggregate the weights. So that was a struggle. And in May of 2010, when we had the big, well-publicized now takedown at the Newburgh Armory, and at the end of the day, I told you I think we had 12 Bloods and Latin Kings that we hadn't found out of the 78, I knew what I had to do because he was one of the ones that was missing. And so after the press conference down in White Plains, and after all the congratulations and all the gear was put away, and I got in my car and I drove over to his mother's house. I knew where she lived because I had picked this kid up for basketball tournaments 5 or 6 years before that, countless times. And I had a conversation with her, which was tough to have because, again, she knew me as coach. And now I'm coming to tell her, I'm looking for your son, and he's going to go away for a while. And all I said to her was, please, I don't want him to get picked up by some police officer that doesn't know him, or him get stopped on 95 heading south to Virginia by a state trooper that finds out he's wanted. Please, have him come in to me. I can't help him beat the charges. I can't. If he was my own blood son, I would treat him the same way. But I will do everything I can to see that he is treated the right way. You have to trust me. And she was hurt and struggling and scared, and she nodded and said she'd do what she could. And 2 days later, I'm at the Newburgh Boys and Girls Club on Liberty Street, and a big guy walks in. Never seen him before, and he was probably about 6'4", 6'5", and I'm bagging up the basketballs and telling the kids to get out of here and go home and do their homework. And he comes walking to the back of the gym, and he just says, "You Coach Jimmy?" I said, "Yeah." And you are? And he told me his name. He says, somebody's looking to get with you. And I'm like, okay, in regards to what? And he mentioned the kid's name. And he said, he'll be behind the Boys and Girls Club at a location that I knew the number of the house, and he'll meet you there. And I said, all right, thank you. And I waited a little bit, and then I walked down the street and went to the location, and he was standing inside with another guy that I knew from the neighborhood that was kind of like a father figure to a lot of the kids there. And we both cried, and I yelled at him, and then I sobbed, and then I put him in my car. I'm in, like I said, a T-shirt and shorts. It's May, end of May, I think it was, or early June, and flip-flops, and drove him to my office in Goshen, which was about 20 minutes away. Went through the drive-through window to get 2 Whoppers, which is what he wanted before he went in. And then I drove him down to White Plains to be processed later that night. And it was a tough thing because, again, like I said, if it was my own son, I would have done the same thing. I have a picture in my house on my wall to this day of that team with him with his arm draped around my son. The two of them have their hands on the same basketball that's in front after a tournament that they won. And I went to all his court hearings, and and I sat with his family, and it was a tough thing because there's people in Newburgh that are mad at me. As I told you, a lot of people know it was the right thing. And there are some people that are mad at me because if you send people to jail, no matter what they did, you're a bad person. And then there were some people in law enforcement that looked at me and said, "Are you insane, sitting with the family?" But it's like I said, I wouldn't do anything to help him beat the charges. I mean, I saw it with my own eyes. I didn't erase the tape. I didn't do any of those things. But he's a family member, and I wanted to help him through the process. And I think his sentence ultimately got reduced when President Obama did the reduction of all the crack cocaine distribution sentences, and I think he did 5 years, and I think he's out. No, I have not talked to him. I would not doubt that our paths will cross again someday, and I hope to see him in a different capacity, and I hope he understands, and I think he does. But I'm glad he's out and hopefully getting on with his life and doing something positive.
Wow. You touched on it a little bit, but I take it that Newburgh is doing much better now?
Murder rates have dropped precipitously. And when I say precipitously, I mean we're not in the double digits anymore. There's 3 homicides, or I think this year there's 4 homicides. That's still 4 mothers that have to grieve the loss of a son, and that's too much. But it is much, much, much lower. The police department has a better relationship today, I believe, and I think this is a credit to them and one of their former chiefs. They have a better relationship with the community. There are community leaders meeting with the police hierarchy at regular times each month. The police chief has an open-door policy on certain days where citizens can come in for complaints. The department's been on the leading edge of pushing to put body cams on officers, and that's all due to the police department. That's not Jimmy Gagliano or the FBI. Those are all good things, and I think they've contributed to a reduction in the homicides. Now, here's the troubling statistic, that last year, higher than any year prior in the last 10, 20 years, the bullet-to-body statistics were the highest they've been in some time. Now, so that means people being shot, bullet-to-body statistics, and they just weren't killed. So I don't think we can rest on our laurels and go, wow, the homicide rate has been reduced significantly, because I fervently believe that without the real hardened gangbangers, the leaders of the Bloods and the Latin Kings that went to jail, that there would have been a lot more grieving mothers and a lot more homicides to compile and keep statistics on. But it troubles me that even though the homicides, the murders, the 187s are down, we still have a troublingly high bullet-to-body statistical category. And I don't know the answer to that. It's going to be the subject of my doctoral pursuit, I think, when I'm working on toward a PhD, and it's going to be on policing methodologies, and it will be looking at this very anomaly, which is how can you bring murders down consistently and over the last 10 years, and yet at the same time have more shootings. It defies logic. And at some point in time, the homicide numbers are going to tick back up. And then what's the reason? Is it the Ferguson effect? Is it the viral video effect? Is it the fact that some criminologists have mused that you can only drive crime down so low, and at some point in time, it has to come back up. That's the part that still keeps me awake at night, even though I'm not in the business anymore.
So how did you finish up your career? And I say that knowing that I was introduced to you from my television set. You know, I saw you doing commentary on CNN. So how did that happen? How did you get from being the supervisory special agent in an RA to being a talking head?
In the summer of 2012, I was facing that ignominious 7-year up-or-out program that Director Mueller had put into place.
Yeah, could you explain it to everyone?
Sure. You know, I joined the FBI in 1991, and at that time, the process for promotions, yes, it was encouraged for agents at the 7, 10, 12-year mark to make a sojourn down to FBI headquarters, which is down in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue, and spend a couple of years on what they call, a desk, basically, overseeing a program for, either a region in the FBI or a collection of FBI offices. And I desperately resisted that. I did not want to go to headquarters. I wanted to either stay where I was or move up the food chain without making that sojourn down there. So I told FBI headquarters, thanks, but no thanks. They said, well, good, then you have a step-down date of such and such. I said, well, I'm going to put in for a deputy legal attaché position in Mexico City, which I got. They sent me to language training. I learned Spanish in 6 months to make me conversational. I went to Mexico City a month after I got there. The legal attaché, which is a senior executive service position in Mexico City, retired. I took his position in acting capacity. I stayed there for a year. It was one of the greatest years I've ever had as far as just a great job, worked with some great agents on some great investigations in a foreign country. I love Mexico dearly. I came back. I was looking to retire, and as timing is everything on our job, as you well know, Jerry, a guy that I worked undercover with back in the early 90s, Diego Rodriguez, got sent back to run the New York office as the assistant director in charge, asked me if I'd stick around for a year and be his chief of staff. I said, I don't know how I could say no to that, so it gave me an opportunity to kind of work with him and the 6 SACs in New York City with, oversight of counterintelligence, counterterrorism, special operations, intelligence, criminal, just every piece of the New York City office to be exposed to that and the inner workings of New York FBI business with headquarters. It was a great opportunity. And then I retired in December of 2015. My desire was to teach. St. John's University gave me a great opportunity to teach undergraduates. St. John's University in Jamaica, Queens. I teach social sciences out there. I teach military history, sociology, homeland security, and criminal justice courses. And the CNN opportunity popped up out of nowhere because one of my final assignments in New York when I was working as the chief of staff was to oversee media operations, public affairs, if you will, which is something that you did for a while, I think, in Philly. Yep. And I had a great opportunity to meet some of the producers from, different national news networks and local networks, and CNN called out of the blue last September when there was that terrorist bombing in New York City in Chelsea, and asked me if I'd be available, and I came down, and I've been doing it now whenever something comes up in the FBI. It's been a great opportunity to go on. I love discussing the Bureau. And then lastly, I work for a company called the Thayer Leader Development Group at West Point, which is basically, I'm a leadership consultant. They have corporate clients, and I'm able to talk about leadership with as much passion and energy as I talk about the FBI, and just give me an outlet for the things I like to do, and just started writing a column for a internet online site called the Havoc Journal, and I write pieces for them. It's an interesting way to be retired because I feel like I'm working longer hours now than even when I was in the FBI, but it definitely scratches all my
tell me about it. Yeah, tell me about that.
You know about that.
All right, well, my last question then is, are you still coaching basketball?
Now that I'm doing the teaching down at St. John's, I had to cut back a little bit on my basketball coaching. When the weather is nice, I get access to the outdoor courts at Newburgh, and I'll do open runs on Saturday or Sunday where I basically put a word out, hey, tell the kids Saturday morning Coach Jimmy's going to be here at 8 o'clock. He'll have a bag of balls and some pennies and a whistle and a scoreboard. And any kids that come down between the ages of 5 and 12, we're going to set up a couple of runs. So that's kind of what I focus on now as far as the coaching thing. I do have the itch. I know that I will go back to it, coaching a team, and especially in Newburgh where you have to do everything. You're not just a coach, but you're, as you know, as we talked about, you're the father figure. You do the bookings, you handle the logistics, you handle the meals, you handle the washing uniforms. It is a full-time gig. I know that I will get back into it, but in the interim right now, while I'm just trying to get my retirement life squared away, and once I get on track and figure out kind of what I'm going to do for real work, then I am going to get back into it. It's never about the basketball. If it was about the basketball, I got cut from the JV basketball team at West Point. So, no one is going to pay me money to coach basketball. Basketball is the carrot that gets them in the front door. Once they're in the front door, now I'm going to expose them to a lot of other things. And for some of them, it may just mean the discipline that I bring to a practice or the discipline I bring to being part of the organization. But these guys, just like you and me, they just want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And and being on a basketball team, a travel AAU basketball team is that. And if they're going to be part of that, then they have to conform to the rules that I lay down because I'm trying to prepare them for life. I want to make sure that they don't end up on some other Jimmy Gagliano's radar 5 years from now, 10 years from now in a gang case. I want them to be like some of the guys that call me and say, Coach, I need a letter of recommendation. I'm halfway through the NYPD process, and I need a reference. Would you be willing to do that? I want that for them. That's the ultimate goal in the end state that I really live for.
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find this episode's show notes where you'll see photos of Jimmy Gagliano with those kids, his basketball team at the Boys and Girls Club. There's also a NBC News video featuring Jimmy with his kids in the gym, taking them through their drills, and a couple of newspaper articles about the work that Jimmy's task force did in bringing that murder rate down in Newburgh, New York. I hope you share the episode with your friends, family, and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of the episode show notes, you'll find all the social media share buttons. And if you're listening to this on your smartphone, of course, you can share it directly from your device. Don't forget to subscribe and review FBI Retired Case File Review. I have a crime fiction recommendation for you this week. It's a strange one because this book was the most misogynistic, racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic book I've ever read. It is called Cop Town by Karen Slaughter. When I first started the book, I said to myself, what am I reading? It is about the Atlanta, Georgia Police Department back in 1974. It is gritty, it is raw, and it is disturbing. This was the first Karen Slaughter book I've ever read, and although at times it made me angry, I gotta tell you, it was a great read. It was a fast-moving, character-driven police procedural. So again, it takes place in 1974. A cop killer is loose. Kate Murphy, who's a rookie cop, and Maggie Lawson, who followed her uncle and brother into the police force, are partnered up because none of the male cops want to work with women. So in this divided world, these two female officers pursue their own investigation looking for this cop killer as they risk their reputations and their lives to solve this steadily increasing number of murders. So I recommend Cop Town by Karen Slaughter and warn you that it is brutally gritty and raw, but oh so good. And while you're on Amazon taking a look at Cop Town by Karen Slaughter, please also check out my FBI crime novel, Pay to Play. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.